Hello, and welcome to EduPulse. We are a brand new podcast for ITT and ECTs and everybody in between, with the sole aim of bridging the gap between research and your classroom. For our first episode, we will be discussing 11 things I wish I'd known before stepping into the classroom. So, Adam, let's crack on. 11 lessons you wish you'd known before walking into the classroom. Take me back to your teacher training. What was that like?
My teacher training was it was a bit of a mesh really between kind of my own kind of ideas and thoughts about teaching, which I think is actually a really important thing for early career teachers and teacher trainers to consider, right? Because when you start an initial teacher training course, you kind of have in your mind that you're learning to do something brand new. But that's not really the case, because everybody comes to initial teacher training with some experience of teaching, because we've all obviously been in schools for like 12, 13 years of our lives, plus possibly university. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what my impression of what teaching was when I started was about what I'd experienced within my own very kind of cocooned educational world growing up. I'd always also sort of been told that, you're great with kids, you've got to go and be a teacher, you're so good at holding their attention, you're brilliant, fantastic with that. And really what that actually meant was you're quite good at entertaining kids. And it just kind of left me sort of woefully unprepared, really, because I kind of thought, right, well, I'll go in with a little bit of my personality and this thing that everyone keeps telling me I've got, which is that I can entertain kids and keep kids interested and engaged, and I'll combine that with what my teachers did, because I did all right, and I'll put that together and I'll be a teacher. And it is just not as simple and straightforward as that at all. And so kind of I had a really rocky road at the start. When I first went into my first NQT job, or as it was then, it's now ECT, I was genuinely a bad teacher. Like, I was woefully unprepared for being in that classroom. The whole thing went terribly wrong. The first school that I worked at, they were lovely. They were really, really supportive. But I just wasn't ready for it at all. Wasn't up to it. And as much as they tried to put in support, there was just nothing that could be done for me at that time. So I ended up having to leave that school, and I went and did supply for a couple of years and just like studied to try and get better at this teaching thing. And then I guess over the sort of 10 years that followed that, before I then went into senior leadership, I was really thinking hard about, right, what would have prepared me a little bit better for the realities of what I was going into when I started out.
Do you know what that reminds me of? A bit of that John Hattie quote, that every child deserves a good teacher, not by chance, but by design. So you're making yourself better on purpose.
Yeah.
And I can't, you're in that situation where you're expecting all this feedback, and you think you're wonderful at this job, and you're getting such great relationships and feedback. And I guess that helps with that argument that's currently buzzing right now, where people are saying it's all about relationships, and you can have great relationships with your students, but if you haven't got that underlying knowledge, that's not going to happen. Let's maybe go to lesson one then. Lesson one for you is, above all else, be realistic and be kind to yourself. Talk me through that.
Yeah, definitely, because I think what sits behind this idea that teaching is really, really difficult is also the reality that you're going to make loads of mistakes. And some of them are going to be quite big mistakes in the moment. And it is just about being kind to yourself and realizing that actually everybody makes those mistakes. I think the problem in some schools, and certainly historically for me when I was starting out, the problem was that people were quite guarded with their mistakes. And I think that was probably a lot around the sort of culture of the schools that I was in, and maybe a little bit about the culture of teaching at the time there, where people didn't talk about mistakes in quite the same way. But you will make some absolute whoppers. I absolutely guarantee it. And the key is just to be kind to yourself and be realistic about it. So I'll give you an example of one of mine. So this was after my NQT years. This is like 2 years in, when like I was actually getting better at being in the classroom. And we were going on a school trip, and we went on a trip to the National Gallery in London. And like I was standing there, and I was doing this. I'd researched it really, really carefully, and I was standing there by this painting and talking these kids through exactly what this painting showed, and they were all writing down notes and they were asking questions, and it was great. And then, like, these people, just loads of people just started filing past. And I was like, this is fantastic, because we're going up to another gallery in a minute, and that place is going to be empty because everyone's leaving. Awesome. And then more and more and more people kept leaving. And then eventually one of the gallery staff came up to me and said, "So have you got a black Nike bag?" I was like, "Yeah, I do." Looking around, and I can't see the bag. And she goes, "Have you been in room 42?" I was like, "Yes, we have." She goes, "You've just had the entire museum evacuated because we
Oh
thought it was a
no.
bomb."
Oh,
And it was mad, because I had, at that point, I had like my head teacher of this school, where I'd only been for about 6 months, had come on the trip as well, because she kind of knew I was sort of early on in my career, and she just watched this whole thing unfold. And then, yeah, as we all kind of had to file out as well, while they went and retrieved my bag, and then sort of opened it with everybody a safe distance away to find my clipboard and pencil case. But yeah, awful, terrible mistake in the moment is what it felt like. But ultimately there was no harm done, and you just had to be realistic about that kind of thing happening, and be kind to yourself. And I think when you go into your first job, it's really, really important to be ready for those mistakes to happen, and just keep them in perspective.
yeah, I think it's about setting your own expectations, and you can have these massively high expectations of yourself, but I think it's also about setting your own standards alongside those, and you can have wants and desires to have an amazing day and to do really good things, and positive vibes and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, as well, I think as a new teacher, your gut instinct will tell you whether you're being supported in that in the school, whether the culture, as you said earlier, is right, whether the school is ready to catch you with open hands and open arms if something does kind of go wrong. Obviously, yours was not as serious as some of the other mistakes that other people make, but that authenticity that you have as a teacher to yourself, I think, is really, really important.
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. I think it's so much of it as well is about just thinking about like where it might go wrong, and just controlling the things. Someone said to me not that long ago, actually, that if you think about like yourself in the middle of these kind of concentric circles, so you've got yourself in the middle, and everything that's in that first layer is stuff that you can control. In the second layer, it's stuff that you can influence, and outside that, it's just stuff that you've got absolutely no control over whatsoever. And I think it's just being aware of what sits within your circle of control, and just being really sure about that stuff. And so often that is about your preparation. So it's about, how well have you thought through those lessons? How prepared are you to go and deliver and talk through that content? Do you know where your hinge point questions are going to go? Have you thought through the activities? All of those kinds of things that are within your control. If somebody throws up within the first like 2 minutes of your lesson, then there's nothing you can do about it. It's well outside your sphere of control.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think as well there's something to be said for having that balance of being over prepared and therefore not being able to shift away and be adaptive and be kind of um, uh, improvisational, I guess, should somebody throw it
Mm.
within the first 5 minutes, and then not being prepared enough because anything can happen? You can find yourself as a new teacher really juggling those two worlds. And I guess maybe talking to your mentor or talking to your supervisor at your school, or even at uni, can really help if you let them know the areas you're concerned about, let them know the areas that you think you might struggle with, maybe point out some strengths to look out for, because we all need that support. Even experienced teachers all need that support.
Yeah, 100%. And I think there is that. There's definitely that that balance to be found between being prepared and just being robotically scripted.
Mm.
And I think you do have to find kind of a middle ground within that. And at the time of recording, there are more ECT jobs out there than there are ECTs qualifying, right? So as an ECT, if you're an ECT looking for your first job, you're in a strong position.
Yeah.
If you're going around and talking to schools and looking at schools that are expecting a written lesson plan, scripting out exactly what you're going to say in every single lesson, then that's maybe a school that you don't want to go to, because it's unsustainable. However, having said that, it is about scripting lessons out and scripting out explanations and models in particular. I think that's a really, really sensible thing to do, especially early on in your career. Perhaps not every single time, but I would certainly be saying sort of 2-3 times a week, have a go at really scripting out exactly what it is you're going to say, especially when it's a concept that you're a little bit more unfamiliar with yourself. Um, but like you say, it's about also being ready to kind of go off on a tangent and grab grab a different direction when it presents itself. Christine Council talks about this as like the core and the hinterland, right? So you've got your core that you're delivering, but then you've also got those kind of splinters of conversations and knowledge that the children will often take you on. And it's important to be adaptable enough to sort of go off on those tangents, but then keep in mind that you've got to bring it back to the core as well. This actually, we might want to jump a little bit because this was going to be lesson 8. But we did the lesson 8 was to take opportunities to go deep when they present themselves.
Yeah.
Should we go into that a little bit?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So yeah, that one. So this is one that I think is it kind of ties in really nicely to what you were just saying there, Chris, about the fact that you've got to be adaptable. And I heard Mick Waters speak at a conference not long ago, at the Pixel National Conference back in September. And he told this lovely story about when he was in a school watching a reception class, and the teacher was at the front, and she had some blocks, and they were kind of counting chorus together, these children. They were going, right, 1 add 1 is 2, 2 add 1 is 3. And he sort of went all the way up, sort of 6 add 1 is, and went 7. And then a kid put their hand up and went, 5 add 2 is 7 as well. And he said, like, you kind of saw the teacher go, that wasn't on the script. I wasn't ready for that one. And Mick said that at the time the teacher was like, have a dojo point, and then kind of moved on. He said that he went to find that child afterwards when they were on their continuous provision, and he was on this massive 100 square, and he was saying to him, can you go and find the number 84? And he bam, straight to it. Can you find 16? Straight to it. And he said to him, you obviously you really like your numbers, don't you? You're really good at your numbers. And apparently this boy was like, yeah, no, I'm good. I like numbers. I like numbers. And he said, because you knew that 5 add 2 was 7, as well as 6 add 1 being 7. And apparently this boy just went, yeah, 4 add 3 is 7 as well, but I didn't tell her that one. I just thought what a fantastic example of like a brilliant opportunity to go, okay, we were doing some work on counting, going one more, but actually there's this new concept that is absolutely related, and there's a really clear link between it. Let's go and explore that a little bit, and then we'll come back to our counting as well, because that can our one more work as well, because that will then reinforce the link between those two concepts, which will hold all children in good stead further down the line. So I think lesson 2, definitely take the opportunities to go deep when they present themselves, and try and marry that up as best as you can with being really kind of scripted and prepared with what you're going to do in particular lessons.
Yeah, well, that's quite a primary focus, isn't it? And I know we're going to have listeners out there who are cross secondary as well. And 3 weeks ago, I had an Ofsted inspection, and she came into my year 11 English poetry lesson, and we had been, as we've been discussing, I've been using Zoe Hellman and Sam Gibbs's book, all about concept-led English curriculum, and I'd really changed tack to try and talk about themes and concepts in English above and beyond kind of the substance of it. And I put this poem, Hawk Roosting. So if any Educast English people out there know that poem, I'm not a massive fan myself. It's just a taste thing, but I put it down in front of them and they'd not seen it before. And we began analysing it. And I got this in my head, the way this lesson should unfold if it's to go really well. And it was absolutely pitch perfect. I'd done a bit of explicit teaching right at the beginning. And then about 20 minutes in, this one lad jumped from my 0.5 to his 0.20, and we'd missed. In the moment, I was like, "Oh, you've jumped ahead! That's amazing! Can anybody else jump onto his idea?" And he missed so many excellent things I was going to teach that I wanted to show the inspector, and I just had to kind of let go of my ego in that moment and just be like, "We've got to go with what the young people in front of us, taking that opportunity to go deeper when it presented itself." And he took us down this path that actually resulted in an element of conversation I hadn't anticipated. And the feedback from that inspector was that she didn't believe they'd never seen the poem before. Their knowledge of it was so deep and entrenched, and she thought that their analysis of it was really mature. And when I tried to explain that they'd not seen the poem before, that we'd just taken those opportunities to go deeper, she couldn't believe it. So that lesson for me, I think you're bang on. With that in mind, your lesson 3, planning for misconceptions.
Yeah. So just for that one, so do you think, just on that last point, do you think that ultimately it's about, as a general rule of thumb, if they're thinking, if the children are thinking about something that is related to what you want them to be thinking about, the general rule, it's okay to let them go? I mean, like from a primary perspective, I would say that that's true. If you know that you want them to be thinking about the links and connections between number bonds, and they make connections that are beyond the point that you were at in your particular lesson, that's okay, because the thinking is still really closely linked to what it is that you want them to be thinking about. So would you agree that that's the case in secondary as well, that as long as you're driving thought towards something that is related and linked to where you want the focus to be, then let it go?
Yes, because I think as the teacher, it's your job to be harvesting those moments and to be moving them in the direction that you want them to. It's possible to take a completely left field comment and bring it back to where you want to go, but trying to tie this down into something that's that's palpable. You've got the whole idea that that memory is the residue of thought, right? And so
Mm,
if a child is saying out loud what they're thinking, they're making their invisible learning visible, right?
mm,
It's a gift that's being given to you. You are being shown what they are thinking. And I think that is an important point for you to take advantage of, really jump onto it and go, thank you so much, let's run with that, because they've made the invisible visible, and they've given you that
mm,
opportunity to peer inside their mind and go, that's what they're thinking. That's fascinating. And evaluate. I was completely wrong. Like I thought we were here and we are so much further on, or actually conceptually we're so much further behind. That is easier to do in subjects that are very specific, like in a secondary school where you have 50 minutes or whatever your lesson length is to really deep dive into something like that. But yeah, absolutely.
mm. It's this idea of orientation, then, isn't it? I guess, like when you when you
Yeah.
have them, when they give you that opportunity to show you what they're actually thinking, it helps you orientate as the teacher as to where are we in this journey towards where I want everybody to get to with their thinking. Yeah, it's a really good orientation technique. So yeah, cool.
Yeah. So
Um,
moving on to planning for misconceptions then.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely key early on in your career, and really, really hard in your career as well, because at that early stage of your career as well, because you've got, by definition, less experience of what misconceptions are going to come up. So the first time you teach column addition, how do you know what kind of misconceptions the pupils are going to come up with? So I would say there, the real key is to speak to your more experienced colleagues and go, right, I'm teaching addition and subtraction for the next 4 weeks. What are the misconceptions that are likely to come up? And if in that example, you are likely to get someone say, well, when they add the ones, they're more than likely going to start. If they're adding 5 and 7 in the ones column, they're more than likely going to try and squeeze like 12 into the ones column of their answer box. And so one of the misconceptions is going to be about the importance of regrouping that into a 10 and 2 ones. And so it just gives you that advantage, because you already know what it is that they're most likely to be tripping up on, what the misconceptions are likely to be, and then you can teach to those. And so, in that lesson, you might show that as an example, and then you might show a correct example alongside it, and you could ask, right, which one is correct? How do you know? Can you explain? Can you explain where I went wrong in this second example? So it just means, again, that you're doing your thinking about what the pupils are thinking during your lesson, and thinking about the mistakes that they're likely to make and the misconceptions that they're likely to have, which just gives you a massive advantage when you're trying to keep everybody on track and making sure that nobody goes off on these tangents that are so wild that they end up with some pretty big concepts that they massively misunderstand further down the line.
Yeah, that happened to me recently. I jumped in to cover a year 5 maths class, and there was a recap of square numbers. And I guess very similarly, when we teach solids, liquids, and gases, everybody teaches about water. But when you get higher up in secondary school, it's really quite a bad example, because water ice is the only solid to float on its liquid self. So it becomes like not the best one to use as an example because it acts in a completely unusual way. And very similarly, I would have just walked into that classroom having picked up the cover and started with 2 squared, right? But the maths teacher she clocked me and went, they'll think it's double because the answer is double, but it's not.
Mm.
Start with 3 squared. And the kind of the light bulb that happened really made me want to see whether she was right or not. And so I started with 3 squared, which was fine, and then we did 4 squared and looked at a couple of things, and then I said, well, what about this one then? And I put 2 squared, and they were like, 4, brilliant. So I said, let's recap for 3 squared, and they put 6. And
Mhm.
I bought it in on purpose just to see, and I was able to show them the misconception pretty early on. I think we did a little rhyme. The little 2 at the top does not mean double. So I walk in and go, little 2 at the top, and they go, does not mean double, because it was just so. I would never have thought of that until a more experienced teacher in that area went, just to save you a couple of minutes, don't use that as an example. It's not a good one. It was a bit of a light bulb moment.
Yeah, and I think that's I think what you described is the best way round to do it as well. I think that's important. I think 99 times out of 100, you're far better off to show the correct understanding first, model that, give a couple of examples that exemplify that, and so that generalization starts to kind of build in their minds, and then show them one that could conflict with that, i.e., the misconception, then unpick that misconception against the correct models that you'd already gone through to begin with. I think starting with the correct is the best way to do it, without doubt, and then
Yeah,
bringing in the
because
misconceptions later.
you don't want their first memory of a brand new concept being the wrong thing.
Yeah, absolutely,
Particularly when we're
absolutely.
looking at the way we learn and encoding and seeing the first thing out of your learning environment being the wrong thing, and you're
Mm.
being asked all this thinking that you haven't done before. It's not particularly fair. Does that move us on to lesson 4, Adam, in terms of like model structures all the time, which was your fourth
Yeah,
lesson?
yeah, definitely, definitely. I think this one is massive. I mean, they're all massive. I think when it's funny, isn't it? When you go into them one at a time, you kind of think, oh, this is really the one. But actually, they're all the one, and that's why I guess there's 11 of them, and teaching so complex.
Yeah,
But yeah, modelling structures all of the time is really really important. Particularly if you're dealing with something that is abstract by its nature. So thinking about, think of an example off the top of my head, like a sentence structure. So quite often, pupils will think that, okay, when I'm writing a sentence, I'm gonna start from the beginning of that sentence, right? Because that's intuitive. That's where you would start your writing from. But actually, in terms of sentence composition, often you actually, especially the higher up you go in primary and certainly into secondary, I would imagine. Talking to a secondary English teacher, I'm sure you'll be able to tell me whether I'm right or wrong about this. But what you actually want them to do is kind of start planning their sentence from the middle. You kind of want, right, okay, we're going to have the main clause that's going to sit in the middle of this sentence, the main idea, and then we're going to bookend that with a fronted adverbial here, or a prepositional phrase there. We're kind of going to build outwards from that, and that concept makes sense, but it makes sense a lot faster if you give them some kind of concrete representation of that. So if you
yeah,
model that, then it can be something as simple as, right, whiteboard pens on a table. Let's split our tables into 3 parts. Middle bit, let's label that main clause. First bit, let's label, or the first column, sorry. Let's label that fronted adverbial for time. And the column on the right, let's label that prepositional phrase. Right, let's now compose a main clause, and we'll actually build it out from the middle. So you're making something that's really abstract, i.e., sentence composition, and you're giving a concrete representation to that. And I think that's what I mean by modeling structures all the time. Is if you make, again, what is invisible visible, then you ensure that everybody in that room has got, as far as you can possibly make sure, has got the same representation of, in this case, sentence building, as each other.
Do you think that for all of our research geeks out there, do you think that kind of, and this is an entire episode in and of itself, because I think the nature of today's episode is we're touching on all of the things that we're potentially going to go into a great deal of detail about at another point. But do you think this
Yeah,
touches onto
yeah.
the world of like dual encoding? Certainly, looking at those model instructions, looking at uh, visual stimuli and auditory stimuli, and the work that Ollie Caviglioli has done on, particularly ironically, mapping out that, because if the teacher is delivering it orally and the kids are discussing it orally and that they can hear it, and then they're seeing models down on paper, that they're from a cognitive load point of view, we're already looking at 2 traces, 3 traces of something that you're trying to teach.
Yeah, I think to be honest, it's probably closer to cognitive load theory
Yeah,
than dual coding in that sense. Just because, yeah, what you're doing ultimately is going, right, we're gonna segment this concept of a sentence, which is a really big thing. And I think that's so often, actually, especially if you're going into a class who are kind of year 4, year 5. Quite often, children's understanding of what a sentence is
yeah,
really, really underdeveloped, and it's wildly different from one person, from one pupil to the next. And so by going, right, okay, we're going to take that massive concept, and now we're actually going to segment that up, and we're going to break it down into these 3 parts. So we're just going to look at one particular type of sentence structure. So we're going to ignore the others. We're just looking at one type of sentence structure. We're then going to break that down into 3 component parts, and we're just going to concentrate on one of those parts at any given time. What it means is that their working memory can be entirely focused on the one part of that sentence construction that you want them thinking about at that time. And over time, what happens is that they will kind of chunk together and assimilate those different parts of that sentence, and it will eventually just feel like one sort of complete body of meaning. Whereas to start with, when you're first teaching that, it's 3 bodies of meaning. It's a construction of a main clause, a construction of a fronted adverbial, a construction of a prepositional phrase. Over time, it will just become a sentence structure that they'll be able to continually call on. But yeah, it's very much taps into cognitive load theory. But going back to dual coding as well, dual coding being the idea that if you support a concept, if you deliver a concept through words and also images that are related to those images, so that the images and the words have the same message, if you present that information through both modalities at the same time, then you're going to encode it twice in memory. Absolutely. And there are lots of really, really good examples of how you could do that, particularly with things like bar modeling. I think is a really, really good example of that in maths as well. So if you've got like a word problem up on the board, and you present a bar model or you draw a bar model that represents the structure of the problem, I think that's a really strong way of doing that.
Hello, everyone. At this point in our conversation, it became clear that we weren't going to get all of the 11 lessons within one episode. Plus, we have an amazing guest to speak to. So this will be part 1 of the 11 things I wish I'd learned before entering a classroom. Part 2 will complete these lessons, and we'll speak to Claire Hudds-Truman, Executive Principal of the Oasis Academy Trust. So this lesson 5, check understanding for everyone all of the time. Like it sounds so obvious, but in this kind of feedback renaissance that we're in now, and a lot of the work that Tom Sherrington's doing on exactly that, checking for understanding from the second you start speaking is so important, and a lesson to experienced teachers, let alone those who are venturing into their first classroom. But talk to me about why you think it's so important, and some of the things that we can do to help each other with that.
I think it's so important because when you teach a particular concept, you're teaching it to 30 different people all at the same time, all of whom have got some prior understanding or no prior understanding that they're bringing to it, and those 30 people are all then making their own inferences and their own connections and coming up with their own sort of definitions of the concept that you're trying to teach, and you've got no idea about whether how sort of closely related any of their different definitions and conceptualizations in their minds are, unless you check. And that's why it's so important to check everybody all of the time. So some ways that you sometimes see this being done, which are ineffective, I think, is if and we've all done it. You teach something, you go, everyone okay with that? Everyone understand? Thumbs up, thumbs down. And of course, if children thinking that they understand is very different from children actually understanding. So those sort of a room full of thumbs up just means they think they understand. That doesn't mean that they definitely do. And it goes back a little bit to what you were saying earlier about trying to make the invisible visible. And you've got to find techniques and strategies for trying to make what they're thinking as visible as you possibly can at those really, really key hinge moments. So you've got to pick your moment. You've got to pick your time for, right, is this moment in my lesson the moment where I really need to know if they understand fully, because I'm about to move on to the next step or the next bit. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger now, a little bit broader. And so I need to know, is everybody with me at this point? So you've got to pick that right moment. And then once you've picked that moment, it's right, how can I reliably sample as many of these different understandings in this room as possible? So there's lots of different ways that you can do that and lots of strategies that you can use for it. So mini whiteboards is a really good one that lots of people use. Just be wary there though. If you're asking a question that requires a really long answer, mini whiteboards are probably going to be less effective for you, because you're going to have, if the answer requires 3 sentences and you've got 30 children all showing you 3 sentences on a mini whiteboard, that's 90 sentences for you to try and process, take in, and then evaluate whether everyone's understood or not, and it's just not doable. That's where things like multiple choice hinge questions are really useful. So you pose a question on the board, you've got 4 different answers, there's a correct answer, but the other 3 will all expose a particular different misconception. So the answers on the whiteboards that they put up are just A, B, C, or D, and you can very, very quickly then survey the room and work out how many children have got it right and how many children have got each misconception, and you can then use that to decide, right, do I need to reteach that or do I need to move on?
Yeah, can I ask for some of our listeners who maybe they've just started their courses, can you just unpack a hinge question for me? I should have asked this earlier when you said it, but forgetting that some people might not have come across that phrasing before.
Yeah. So when you think about your lesson, and you think about, you'll have your sort of end point in mind, and then you'll map backwards and plan backwards probably. All of your kind of key milestones in that lesson or in that learning sequence, I would suggest actually is a better way of doing it. So a sequence of lessons rather than each lesson individually. But however your school kind of expects you to do it, you'll have kind of milestones along the way where you'll think, right, okay, I've got to get them to the point where they all understand this bit, and then I can move them on to this to this next part, if you like. So, for example, with going back to the column addition example that we spoke about earlier, if you can get them to the point where they understand column addition without exchange, without exchange, then we can move on to column addition with exchange. So you've got to be absolutely sure that they've got column addition without exchange first. So that would be a hinge moment, because the success of what comes next, or the clarity of what comes next, depends on or hinges on whether they've really understood that that initial concept that you've begun to teach.
And so thank you for that. Can you go into a little bit of detail about the difference between checking for understanding and checking for listening, which I know is something you talk about, and kind of like where the difference there lies? Because linking it back to something Tom Sherrington says, where he says that task completion is a poor proxy for learning, and certainly linking into, are you checking for their understanding, or are you just checking that they're listening?
Yeah, and I think checking for listening it's really important that people don't confuse checking for listening with using questioning as a behaviour management tool. That's a really, really important difference to see, I think, because the temptation, and I did this a lot in the early part of my career, where I would go, I don't know, I'd be teaching about photosynthesis, and I'd go, right, Jack, what's photosynthesis? That Jack hadn't been listening, and everybody knew that Jack hadn't been listening. And even in the tone of my voice, I made it clear that I knew that Jack wasn't going to know this answer, and I was asking him because he hadn't been listening, and I was trying to show him up. And that it's just not the right way. It's not the right way, firstly, to build relationships in the classroom, but it's also not the right way to use questioning, because all you do by doing that is send a message to everybody else that questioning is there to try and catch you out. And what you're trying to do with questioning really is drive thought. And you're never going to get that culture in your classroom if you intersperse that use of it with using it to catch people out. Having said that, it is really important that you know that people have been listening to everything that you've said. And so I think it's just thinking about how you phrase those questions to make sure that, okay, this isn't necessarily one that you need to be thinking deeply about. So I'm going to ask you a question about something that I have literally just said. And so I just want to know that you can repeat to me what I've just said, or you can reword what I've just said. Just so I can make sure that, yes, you've listened along to the concept and the explanation that I've given up to this point. So I'm not necessarily asking you to think deeply or make any connections to anything else. I just want to know that you've heard and understood and listened to what I just said.
Yeah, you're totally right about using it as a disciplinary tool. We've all done that. You've done it in the moment. You're a bit angry that this person isn't listening to you. You're giving a lot in the classroom. Everybody's answering back. And this, have we called him Jack? Is Jack now the student?
Jack's the guy.
Yeah, that's it. From now on, Jack's having a bit of a wander around. I think one of the things I try and do at school is make sure that any answer I get, it's received in a full sentence. And that for me really... it has a dual purpose, possibly three purposes. Off the top of my head, the first one is they aren't just giving me an answer. They aren't just that's a word, because by answering in a full sentence, they're showing me the context of the answer they're putting it in. They're not just saying 52 or revenge. You getting them to say the theme of this part of Macbeth is revenge because, and then I'll say because, and they won't just be able to say because words. So encouraging a dialogue in the classroom whereby answering in full sentences is not only expected but it's mandatory, can really help me as a teacher. And once again, this is what's so important. All of these things that are the pieces of sage advice, sure, but it's also deeply personal. And so from my own understanding of their understanding can sometimes be in not letting them just say a word. That it might be the correct answer, but if I'm looking, as you say, for deeper connections, deeper meanings, then getting them to answer in full sentences. The only time that stops being efficacious in any way is when 4 or 5 have done it and the sixth person then just goes, the square root of dot is blah. Because then it just becomes parroting and they're copying what their friend has said. It's not something that's usable by anybody else. And then very often I'll take the best sentence answer and we'll whack that up on a board or on a visualizer. We'll have a chat. How can we make this sentence better? Because particularly as you get higher up the secondary sequence, if you like, the more important these high value sentences become, particularly at GCSEs, and especially at A-levels. You have a very set specific period of time to write a lot of specific information in. And if you can't get all of that into a really neat, succinct sentence, and you're just going to waffle on, then you're going to run out of time and you aren't going to get the marks. Just wrapping up that then. So we've got our first 5 lessons. So your first lesson was, above all else, be realistic and kind to yourself. And then we swapped them around, didn't we? So then lesson 2 is taking those opportunities for going deeper. Yep. Lesson 3 being planning for misconceptions. Your 4th lesson is model structures all of the time. And the lesson we've just done is speaking about checking understanding all of the time as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
And that concludes part 1 of 11 things I wish I'd known before I entered the classroom. We hope you've enjoyed our first episode. If you have any questions or any comments at all, please find us over on Twitter at EduPulse Co and on our website, edupulse.co. And we'll see you next time.